Hello, this is a video that is primarily aimed at Bath Spa second year students who are doing modern and contemporary poetry. So this has always been a course that kind of invites you to do a lot of independent research and to explore and investigate the modern and contemporary poetry that is out there and find things that you feel engaged with, things that are interesting, exciting, and kind of develop your own critical tools and your own approaches and specific areas of interest. And obviously, with the coronavirus and us all being scattered everywhere, I thought it would be useful to just very quickly go through a few online resources and talk about how they might kind of feed into your independent research. So, poetryfoundation.org is a really big, constantly growing site filled with lots of poems, information about poets, and additional resources. It includes kind of older poetry, but it is very good on modern and contemporary poetry, on poetry since 1900. And you can see it's kind of organized into these loose schools or movements. We looked at Frank O'Hara in an earlier video, a New York school poet, part of the kind of earlier generation with people like Barbara Guest and John Ashbery, and then making way later on for poets like Alice Notley, Anne Waldman, I guess, possibly Eileen Miles. One of the things I guess I should say about these kind of broad movements is that they're very useful to get a sense of the overall shape of the history of modern and contemporary poetry. But the individuals who belong to them very often will kind of reject that label. There's a tension there. It's very enjoyable to be part of something bigger than yourself. It's important to kind of show solidarity with other writers and artists, and to be kind of plugged into the social and cultural and political things that are happening at your particular time and place. But on the other hand, nobody, and to generalize a little bit, perhaps poets in particular, really enjoys being pigeonholed. So many of these labels will actually be resisted, or the particular poets who belong to them may offer kind of quite idiosyncratic interpretations of what they mean. But for our purposes, I think they are a good way to kind of get a broad shape of how different kinds of innovations, experiments, concerns might be clumping together, might be talking to one another, might be responding to one another, might be responding to perceived limitations in one another. And if you just look on Wikipedia, well, how would you use Wikipedia on a course like this? I guess one of the things that it's quite useful for is just a kind of quite convenient source of background reading. So although on this course we don't place that much emphasis on using literary criticism, on using secondary sources where a critic presents their particular interpretation of a text, it can still be very useful for your own close reading to augment your understanding by doing just a little bit of background reading about the time and place in which a poem was written. So for example, Harlem Renaissance, obviously 1920s Harlem, poets like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Angela Weld Grimke, something like the Black Arts movement, again in the USA, in the kind of from the mid 1960s onwards, really. And something like Wikipedia can be very useful for understanding how a particular cultural, aesthetic, literary movement might be resonating with events that are happening at the time. So in the case of the Black Arts movement, that's very much the civil rights movement and the shift from the civil rights movement to Black Power in the 60s and 70s. So a kind of a new kind of anti-racism that builds on the civil rights movement, but also very much responds to its perceived limitations in terms of its emphasis on formal legal equalities and rights that don't always translate to kind of substantive equity, and the civil rights movement's commitment to responding to racist violence with non-violence. So Wikipedia, just a kind of convenient, not always reliable source of background reading, really, really great for both for getting ideas and for just kind of informing yourself about the social historical context of some of the poems that you might be close reading. And if you do find limitations on Wikipedia, I would totally encourage you to get stuck in and to fix things. It is like such a thrill. So modernpoetry.org.uk, a big site run by the poet Peter Philpott, and it contains a really great list of links to contemporary poetry magazines that are online. So this is another great source for poetry for you. Obviously, the course has this kind of Google test thing, so we can talk about that a little bit more in another video, but essentially we're asking you to emphasize poetry that hasn't had much written about it yet. And an easy way of doing that is by looking at really, really recent poetry where nobody's had a chance to write anything about it yet. So you can be the first. So you'll find lots of different online websites there. Amber Flora is a good one. Tentacular, Data Bleed Zine. And I think all of these can offer you interesting, challenging, exciting poetry, and a lot of variety. So again, it's not a course that really emphasizes secondary sources that much, but I have to absolutely flag up Google Scholar, which is probably something you're very familiar with, but worth emphasizing. So Google Scholar aggregates all kinds of different academic journals. It's a good place to find literary criticism. Why might you be looking for literary criticism on this particular course? Well, you might be wanting to use it to inform the writing of your anthology introduction. You might be looking up some particular topic once you've gone down the rabbit hole of close reading a poem, and you might find, okay, I don't yet know all the things that I need to know to really fully understand this poem, so I'm going to research it, and this is the place where I'm going to go to research it. But there's another reason that you might be using Google Scholar, and that's really just to kind of look for examples and models to kind of familiarize yourself with the sorts of things that literary critics do and say. So this will be a good source for, scholarship, literary criticism, academic articles in literary studies, great for ideas, for inspiration, studying the kinds of things that literary critics do and learning that way, kind of learning by observing what they do and applying some of their concepts, techniques, methods in your own research and writing. JSTOR is another really, really great source, focuses specifically on arts and humanities, so literary studies and other arts and humanities disciplines. And through JSTOR and through Google Scholar, you will maybe eventually find particular academic journals that you like and that you can keep coming back to because you found them kind of trustworthy, reliable, often interesting. Textual Practice, Green Letters. Academic journals are extremely annoying in that you normally have to kind of log in again and again and again, and you probably won't know whether or not you have access through BathSpot until you have logged in, but that's what it is. Then there are plenty of other kind of websites, magazines, journals out there that are not peer-reviewed. So stuff like this, these are what's known as peer-reviewed scholarship, which in theory means that everything that's been submitted and accepted has gone through a kind of process that ensures that it is rigorous and high-quality scholarship. In theory, that's how it works. But then there's this kind of whole world of quasi-academic stuff which may not have gone through that process. So maybe it's a little bit more variable, a little bit more ropey. And it also might have a kind of wider variety of aims and motives. People might not have, they might be trying to do other things than rigorous scholarship. And this one I think is particularly interesting for you guys, praccrit.com. And it's particularly interesting because it focuses on individual poems, and each individual poem comes with somebody's response. Sometimes it's like a close reading, sometimes it's a different kind of response. So that's another kind of source of examples. If you're wondering, like, what is a close reading? What ways are there of responding critically to a poem? Here are where you might find potentially some good examples. And this is little magazine that I used to edit. We did 8 issues, and it's called Hicks Eros. So if you Google Hicks Eros, you can find that. And again, the thing that might be useful for you guys is that in some of the issues, there are little articles, quite short articles that focus on individual poems. So again, not exactly what you would want to do in your close reading essays, but in the same sort of ballpark. And they're also kind of reviews of poetry pamphlets and things like that. The OED is your friend. You know that by now. The OED is going to tell you about individual words and their curious histories. And it's going to do that mainly through quotations. So you can see all the different ways in which a word has been used historically. And how it has transformed and changed. Nice biscuit. Over time. So back to poetryfoundation.org. Its resources include this list of this glossary, which includes some kind of technical terms, some jargon. And so what do we think about jargon? How do we use technical terms? How important are they, and in what ways are they important? So close reading poem is not, it's not a kind of bingo. It's not a matter of just like identifying which tropes or techniques are being used and checking them off and getting points. And also there are just like gazillions of terms, of technical terms of literary criticism out there. I'll show you some more in a minute. And there's absolutely no expectation that you kind of have to like learn them all, or even learn like a gigantic chunk of them. But that said, I do think that technical terminology is useful and can kind of extend and expand and augment your powers as literary critics. And how does it do that? In a number of ways. If you have a few technical terms in your back pocket, then it kind of focuses your attention in certain ways so that you can spot those things when they crop up again and again. You can recognize them, whereas otherwise you might not. It also allows you basically to succinctly refer to them, which is helpful when you're writing an essay and you don't have a lot of words. You might not want to spend a whole paragraph describing something. You might want to just briefly give it a name. So Poetry Foundation has got a glossary. There are plenty of other ones. The poets.org one is, what I like about this one is that it's quite short. The definitions are quite short, but then it has these little articles that you can drill into and find out more. And there are plenty more online. So this site, Silva Rhetorica, is a little bit more focused on the rhetoric of earlier periods, so not quite so applicable to modern and contemporary poetry. It's basically, I think, it's a kind of aggregation of a number of manuals of rhetoric from various periods, certainly from early modern period. And I don't know what most of these things mean, but I think this is a great site if you kind of have a really strong hunch that there is a word for the thing you're trying to describe. There's a technical term and you can't find it. This might be a good place to go exploring. Don't spend forever, but anakluthon, that's a useful one. A grammatical interruption or lack of implied sequence within a sentence. So yeah, I think it is just useful sometimes to have kind of your own personal set of technical terms that you kind of keep adding to every now and then, things that you find useful, and you already all do have that kind of thing. You've learned it at school, and you've learned it in your first year, and you've continued to learn it this year as well. But personification or prosopopoeia, the when a thing kind of speaks as a person, apostrophe, which it's a punctuation mark, obviously, but it's also the address to somebody who isn't present or some abstract quality. Oh, mysterious priest! Oh, moon! Justice, where are you? J.K. Rowling, hear me. And it's just kind of useful, I think, sometimes to be able to see something and spot something and feel, okay, I know what that is. I know what to call that. I saw a tweet by J.K. Rowling just the other day, yesterday, I think, where she was saying like, oh, it's the 22nd anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, but actually, I don't want to speak about that right now because, who can be speaking about fictional deaths at a time like this during the battle of the coronavirus? And I was just like, aha, okay, cool. That's apophasis. I know what that is. That is saying you're not bringing something up as a way of bringing it up. So yeah, I think that that jargon and technical terms are basically good. They're good to explore. They're good to play around with. You won't kind of you don't have to worry either way, right? If you think, oh no, I'm not using enough of them, that's probably fine. If you think, oh no, am I using too many of them, that's probably fine as well. It's something for you to kind of explore, to use those terms to focus your attention, to name things that would otherwise be difficult to name, and to kind of explore, what a poem is, what it's actually doing. Try and use these terms to kind of actually throw some light on what the poem is doing, what it's saying, and you'll be absolutely fine. And you don't need to kind of like sit there memorizing each one. Okay, so just a few more really quickly. Archiveofthenow.org is a really great repository of recordings of poets, I think mostly sound recordings and possibly some videos. And yeah, set up by, is she there actually? Set up by the poet Andrea Brady, among others. And yeah, just another great place to kind of go exploring and finding poets and poetry you might like. 1 minute I am sitting in spud you like, intoxicated with abnegation, in the village of cats, but there I am one morning, waking up to find myself in bed with both great compassion and the 6 classes of being, the stiffness of winter, followed by the amputation of a leg dust, a shadow, and naked shingles of the world. And it's nice to be able to hear poets reading in their own voices, which is what you can get on this site. Pen Sound, another really big site filled with resources, including a lot of readings by poets. Ubu Web, also ubu.com, filled with lots and lots of resources. I think quite a good emphasis on visual poetry and sound poetry. So archive.org, the Internet Archive, is just this. I mean, you've probably come across it, an absolute mass of stuff. And you can find all kinds of things there. So just Googling here, Black Arts Movement, it's turned up, a class by Amiri Baraka, a whole bunch of books that you can borrow, all kinds of things. Research for... It's not in any way kind of focused on poetry or literature, but it's just absolutely massive, and you can find interesting things in there. And then finally, Instagram. So Instagram, how would you use it? I would say that it's a good place to maybe find small, interesting poetry presses and see kind of what they're doing, what's happening, and keeping up to date with stuff. Maybe some poets as well. I would say just like use it carefully, because it's quite hard to kind of filter out the signal from the noise, if that's not too mean a way to put it. There's a lot of there's a lot of work on a lot of poetry on Instagram that I don't find that engaging, and that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to students in the first instance. It could be a distraction from more interesting things that you could be finding elsewhere. But still a really great place to kind of find out about contemporary poetry communities and what's happening right now. Okay, I think that's all I had